Welcome, everyone. I am Bob Wurzelbacher, the director of the Respect Life Office for the Archdiocese of Cincinnati, and this is our video podcast series that we call Being Pro-Life. Each month, we'll discuss a different topic in the Respect Life arena. We'll hear a personal story from someone deeply affected by that issue, and finally, we'll share ways that you can get involved. This month's topic is universal design and welcoming those with disabilities. This month, we have several guests. Will you please introduce yourselves?
Hi, Bob. I'm Ann Masters, the Director for Pastoral Ministry with Persons with Disabilities for the Archdiocese of Newark in New Jersey, and I'm a member of the Council on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities for the National Catholic Partnership on Disability.
My name is Cindy Swanson. I am a baptized Catholic. My husband and I have 3 sons. Our middle son has Down syndrome. He's a 32-year-old man. And when Adam was 7, I lost my vision. That's what brought me to my involvement with the National Catholic Partnership for Disabilities. I was on that board for about 10 years, and I was on the Council for Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities for about 3 years.
My name is Father Matthew Schneider. I'm a priest of the Legionaries of Christ. I currently live in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia.
My name's Taylor Hyatt. I'm a disability rights activist. I've been a walker and wheelchair user for my entire life. I have cerebral palsy as a result of being born 3 months early. Essentially, it's brain damage in the part of my brain that controls my legs.
Okay, Ann, well, let's start with you. So universal accessible design, that's a phrase that might not be very familiar to people. So what does that refer to?
Now, what universal design started with is talking about physical structures of buildings. So that's where ramps have come into play. But then accessible design has been added to it because that references not only getting into the building, but being able to understand what's being talked about, understand the material, that the event is open to you. In other words, if you use a wheelchair, that not only can you get into the building, but there's room for you to be there in your wheelchair. Or if you need to have an interpreter for American Sign Language. So is the communication accessible?
And so what are some basic principles to make the church accessible in different areas of participation?
Basic principles, first of all, is to just start with the person. Focus on the person in front of you and not think about setting up a program for individuals with disabilities. How does he or she communicate? How does he or she interact in the world? How do they move around? Are they able to walk? Do they use a wheelchair? Do they use a cane? Do they have vision? Are they blind? How do they learn? So instead of focusing on actual diagnostic labels, focusing on the individual person, are there any particular behaviors to be concerned about? It's really focusing on establishing a relationship. The challenge is we don't really live that very well.
What do they say accessibility means to them, and what are they asking for from the church?
So the number one thing that individuals and families with disabilities say they want is to feel like they belong. And Eric Carter is an inclusive educator at the Kennedy Center at Vanderbilt University, and he's interviewed 500 teenagers with autism and intellectual disabilities and their families, and asked them about their experiences in congregational life and what they want. And that has been the overwhelming response, to feel like they belong, which is something I think all of us can relate to. But what does belonging look like? And that was another gift from Eric's work. And these 10 dimensions that he's identified, he and the researchers, the first thing is to be present. You can't have a presence if you're not present. And to be noticed as a person, not a category or a diagnostic label. To be welcomed, to be known and accepted, supported, cared for, befriended, needed, loved. Those are all things that they describe as feeling like they belong someplace when that happens. When someone comes in who's using a wheelchair, or maybe an individual with Down syndrome, people want to help. That feels good, to be helpful.
Right.
But they don't want to let the other person with a disability to do something for them. They want to be always giving. So what individuals with disabilities want, yes, to be cared for when that's needed, but also to be needed, to be recognized as having gifts to share.
Cindy, so it sounds like you have a lot that we can talk about. You have a son who has Down syndrome. So tell me a little bit about what is it like having a child with Down syndrome and trying to get the religious education and formation you might typically want to get that a, shall we say, neurotypical child might easily get at a typical Catholic parish.
We didn't know he had Down syndrome at the pregnancy, and when he was born, it was determined pretty much immediately. And one of my first thoughts was, will this kid ever be able to be an altar server? Because
Right.
that's one of the rituals we as Catholics celebrate and watch our children grow and become a part of. And so it was always in my mind that I knew we were going to struggle. And I kind of did a Scarlett O'Hara stance that, as God is my witness, I will not fight with the church about him being included. And indeed, in my community at the time, there were 5 Catholic churches, and of the 5, 4 said he could not be in regular religion class. One church, St. Margaret Mary, said, yes, he will be included because he is a part of our world. And so he was catechized with the rest of his friends. My thinking was that nowhere in my study as a child in religion class or later doing Bible study did Jesus ever say, bring me the little children. But those with disabilities, send them to another room. Jesus had his arms wide open for everybody, and it was our responsibility to honor every one of God's children and bring them into the fold and not segregate them.
What did it take for a religious education program at a parish to do something to allow him to be included? Were there certain accommodations that had to be made? Did he have a different tutor? Did they have to change the way they taught the class?
The second grade religion teacher, I'll always remember this, the message I got back was, Adam is a very good little boy, which meant he didn't really cause any trouble, so he was okay. But she didn't know if he got it. And I wrote back and I said, you know what? It's a mystery. I don't get it either. It's called faith. Let's move forward. He's a little 7-year-old boy. Let's ask the others if they get it too. None of us really gets it. And what it did take was a pastor who had a culture of inclusion. They also knew that I didn't just say, here, go do it. They could depend on me to do some pre-learning and that sort of thing. But religious said, it isn't really education, it's formation, right? So we talk about religious formation and how we love one another and how we treat one another. So it's not just an issue of reciting back some words that you learn in a didactic kind of a situation,
Right.
but it's just how you treat one another. And that's really more important to me than what I learned as a child in the 60s, which was the Waldorf Catechism. The bottom line is really what we're taught by Jesus Christ is building a relationship. I never wanted to just send my child someplace and say, here, you take care of him. So it was really a triad of work, the teacher, myself, and my son all working together. Another thing is that we don't have the money to do it. I don't have the expertise. Well, when that baby was born, I didn't get any extra money. I didn't get a book. We just figured it out because we loved him. He was our baby. There may be more need of support. I won't deny that. I need a different kind of support, and I do pretty darn well. I was blind for 6 years, and I went back to school to get my MSW. I'm a licensed school social worker. I can't see a bus in front of me. But I remember a time, Bob, living in Chicago where people like me were walking with a tin can begging for money who are blind. And today we look at that so differently, right? So
Right.
someday we're going to be embarrassed at how we looked at people with autism or Down syndrome as we might be with people who are blind from the 50s and 60s. 41, when I lost my vision, he was 7. So I have what's called Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy, where the mitochondria of the optic nerve cell atrophied. So how it impacted me, obviously, I couldn't read anything that the church was doing. I didn't do Braille. I couldn't do Braille anyway because I have neuropathy, so I couldn't feel the bumps in a Braille situation. The interesting thing, Bob, is most people who are visually impaired lose their vision later in life, either through multiple sclerosis, diabetes, that sort of thing. So the first accommodation for blind people is Braille, and most of those people don't do Braille because they probably have a neuropathy of some sort. So the vision thing was challenging.
So Cindy, can you tell us a little bit then about what were the struggles that you have had when you lost your vision to continue to be active in your parish?
It was transportation was a lot of work on my part. And you do get to the point where you say, these people around me that see me struggling, if they can't come and say, can I help you get a ride to church on Sundays? Then, you just kind of surrender to it.
So Father Matthew, why don't you tell a little about your history with autism?
I always felt a little bit different, but I never really felt so substantially different. But then my first year after I was ordained, I was assigned to be a school chaplain up at a school in Canada. And after the first year of that, they were kind of like, we don't want you back, even though we kind of set it up for 3 years. And I'm wondering what's going on. And they started saying, well, you're not picking up this sign and that sign with all the kids and all the kind of social interaction things that you should be picking up from these kids. And they suggested maybe Asperger's or autism or something like that. And so a little bit after that, I end up getting diagnosed. When I was first diagnosed, I was kind of really down on that. But within a few weeks, as I started to read up, I realized, oh, wow, like these things that I thought were just a little bit different are actually much more substantially different than I had previously thought. For example, there's a lot of things that most people do subconsciously in social interactions where I've always done them consciously, and I just assumed everybody else is doing them consciously, just maybe a little bit better than I was. But then I realized, oh no, they're all just doing them subconsciously, and it's not even like a thought process for them. And I also realized around the same time, well, there's very little in the Catholic Church really reaching out to this community. When right now with the current diagnostic criteria and everything, you're looking at 1.5%, 2% of the population, and you look at how much ministry overall in North America there is, and I'm like, there's almost nothing. And so I realized that at some future point, I need to be public about being autistic as a priest, as really a way to reach out to others who are autistic.
You were focusing particularly, I think, on difficulty reading people's faces, reading their emotions, understanding what people are expressing. Is that a fair statement there?
Yes, that's something that almost everyone on the spectrum struggles with. I think we have a different way of expressing facial expressions and emotions and things. And oftentimes we can understand each other, but since we're, 1.5%, 2% of the population,
Right.
it could be a real struggle to understand everybody else. Some of the other things with autism are things like sensory sensitivities or other aspects of, just how you think, the way you process information. And also it's often comorbid with a lot of other conditions like anxiety, intellectual disability, ADHD, and things like that as well.
If you have a child, right, with those kinds of issues, what makes it more difficult to bring that child to Mass?
With Mass, one of the biggest difficulties is just, the lights, the sounds, the smells, and things like that are often a big challenge. We can get overwhelmed. And then there's other aspects with acceptance in the parish community. Like, for example, a lot of autistics will do things like stimming, where they do things like they'll flap their hands, or like I have here in my desk, just like little things to play with that can, at a normal Mass, can often seem distracting to other people and can create a kind of judgment from other people. But for us, if I'm doing something like that, I'll often actually be more attentive, and I'm doing that to regulate my sensory input. Whereas a lot of other people can regulate it completely internally, I need to have that external aspect to regulate it.
At a typical Mass, if you have a child who has difficulty with some of these sensory input, how does a child react to that? Why is it a problem?
It's like our sensory filtering is different. So something like, which sounds like normal volume for music for others might sound like standing right in front of the speaker at a rock concert. And as well, sometimes it's like, it's hard to even understand it, because a lot of times when kids are little, they don't understand exactly why, and they can't express themselves well. Like I can explain to you this particular set of sounds is difficult for me to process, but somebody who's 5 is just like, oh, this is this is difficult, and they just start reacting and running around and all kinds of things, because they don't know how to express themselves that well at 5, which is pretty normal for
For a
no matter
12-year-old,
who they are. 5-year-olds often have trouble expressing themselves in adult language.
What about religious education, right, for people with sensory issues?
I think a lot of times it depends on looking at what their sensory issues are. Sometimes it just might be that they have their first communion at one of those sensory friendly masses or something like that. There can be other issues as far as what class they do. Like, for instance, if they have a difficulty with crosstalk, for the teacher to be very attentive in their class to make sure other people aren't talking while the teacher's talking. And as well, I think to make sure it's presented kind of in that more rational way, so it doesn't seem emotionally overwhelming, because a lot of us can very easily become emotionally overwhelmed as well. And if the person also has some kind of developmental disability or intellectual delay, which is way more common with being autistic, Loyola Press out of Chicago has an adaptive First Communion kit, which is a simplified version. If you look online, I did an unboxing video of the First Reconciliation Kit on YouTube.
So let's start with, what is it like trying to be an active member at a parish, someone who has cerebral palsy and has to use a wheelchair or a walker at times? What are the difficulties that you typically encounter at a parish?
That's an interesting question. They tend to vary parish by parish, city by city. The setup changes depending on where you go. You're never quite sure what you're going to get. A ministry that I was involved in my teenage years was doing mass readings and singing in the choir. In the parish I attended in high school, there was a ramp to take you up to the sanctuary, but I'm not even 5 feet tall, so when it came time to actually do a mass reading or reach the microphone, I would need to sit in a computer chair that raised and lowered and have, at the time, my choir teacher jimmy that and kind of help me steer out of the way when I was done. I am so incredibly grateful to the former youth leaders at my parish, helping me come along for retreats. Fast forward to the present day, most parishes have ramps on them or elevators. The one nuisance that comes to mind is elevator keys, whether they leave them out in the open for you to use or whether you have to call a staff member who will give you the key and escort you up and down. If you're new to the parish, that can be hard because you don't know where the key is, you don't know who to ask.
Many churches, most churches, right at the podium, you simply have to stand or you can't read
Yeah.
on the podium. It's just that simple. It's the way it's designed. That could be the first thing. I know there's a lot of churches, they're going to have ramps that take you into the church, but whether or not they have ramps to go into the sanctuary, they're telling people, well, you're not welcome to be a reader. So Ann, do you want to talk a little bit about your website? We can show that on the screen if you'd like.
Yes, go to www.rcan.org/disabilities.
Ministry with persons with disabilities at the Archdiocese of Newark. So what can we find on this page?
That then to the right, you'll see that there's newsletters for pastoral leaders, liturgy supports. If you click on that, actually, you can see it has, scrolling down, there's a presentation on the revised guidelines for celebration of the sacraments with persons with disabilities, and also a link for the bishop website on the revised guidelines. It's really important for our viewers and listeners to realize that this is not a new subject in the church. In 1978, the U.S. bishops wrote a pastoral statement on persons with disabilities. And then in 1995, again saying, yes, no, we really do mean this. And so access to the sacraments is important for individuals with disabilities. And in case you really didn't get it in 2017, to amplify the message, and also covering some new situations that have come about from technology. So for example, with prenatal diagnosis, ways to support the families, and also the catechetical guidelines too in 2005, as well as the earlier one in 78, all again about including individuals with disabilities.
Other things on this website you want to point out?
It's something to scroll through and see, and I'm also happy to respond to email or phone requests.
We can put that up on the screen as well for people who are watching it on the video, or it'll be on our website. Anything else you want to say, whether it's to a parish leader or even to the regular person in the pew? How can we be better as a church for all people?
We could do a fabulous Bible study with people who have intellectual and developmental disabilities by looking at your own Ohio State University's Next Chapter Book Club and use that model for Bible study. So it's all over. It's all over. You don't have to look too far. It's right in your own backyard with NCPD and these different kind of sources. Talk to all those good people at NCPD. There are scholars and there are people who are doing the work, feet flat on the ground on how we make this happen. So for those of you who have children with disabilities, we don't need another program. You tell your Right to Life people, you know what? I want to be part of you. My son, my child has great gifts that you will miss out if he is not sitting with you.
One of the biggest things is just not to be alarmed, not to be worried, not to be concerned if someone has something a little bit different. What Jesus teaches us is to accept everyone and to help everyone to follow virtue, to live virtue, to imitate him. And that's going to look a little different for people in different situations. This person trying to live in this world that's difficult for them in the way they can.
Presume competence, presume that the person with disabilities does have an active role to play, does want to use their capabilities to their full potential. Yes, that includes some kind of modification, accommodation, additional supports, but participation with modifications should not be looked down on to the point where it should be seen as better not to participate at all.
Oftentimes, the most important things that happen don't cost a lot of money. And I know parishes are worried about finances and budgets, but an open heart is going to take you far.
All right. Well, thank you for talking with us today about people with disabilities and how we can be much more welcoming. Hopefully, we've learned a few things that we can take home to our parishes, how we can all reach out to the marginalized in our community. So thank you for spending time with us today.
Thank you so much for having me today, Bob.
Thank you. Have a good day.
If anybody wants to reach out, you can find me online, Autistic Priest on Facebook and Twitter. God bless you, Bob.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
And I want to thank all of our viewers and listeners for tuning in on this episode of our Being Pro-Life series. Head to the website and view all the links talked about in this episode at www.catholiccincinnati.org/being-pro-life. Thank you again for joining us today, and I look forward to being with you next time.